Cool. All right, we are recording here with Josh. How you doing, Josh?
Doing good. Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. You've written not a as huge of a quantity, but I think a high quality of a couple of different articles. Um, you have one which is, I mean, quite bold. The grand theory of right and left. Is there still hope? Can we figure this liberalism thing out? What's going on with this? What is this big grand theory?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The solution to all of the world's most complicated problems is pretty simple. Basically, all you have to do is elect Pete Buttigieg to president of the United States. That's basically it. But more, I go into that and I talk about Pete Buttigieg a little bit, but more seriously, I mean, when you're writing things and when you're trying to capture people's attention, and if anything, it looks like I've succeeded, you do want to have sort of like a bold title. With that being said, the right and the left is something that people talk about. They treat it as if it's a real concept. Obviously, it's an abstraction of a whole lot of different things. So, like in the article, I basically say that as an example, if you believe in evolution, if you believe in maybe increased taxation, and there's a few things. If you believe in abortion, the right to have abortions, then you're on the left, whatever that might be. And then I give some examples of what will put you on the right. But if you believe that Trump won the 2020 election, for example, you would basically be on the right. I don't know that there's any other type of opinion you could smuggle in with that would put someone on the left who also believes that Trump won the 2020 election. But basically, like, there is a right and a left. It's imperfect. It doesn't capture a lot of the most important things that I think people should be talking about. But it definitely exists. So as far as the grand theory, I mean, there's plenty of theories, right? Like, people have written big theories about the right and the left. What I focus on is I sort of come at it from a freedom angle. So basically, I say that, there's some evidence that the most common configuration of the right and the left globally is basically pro freedom and anti freedom. This is the most logical application of liberty. So if someone wants to institute cultural authoritarianism, or if they want to try to control culture, they almost always want to also control the economy. That's only logical, right? Why would you allow things like technology and CEOs and these big tech executives to sort of run amok, influencing the culture, when you specifically don't want them to do that? So you will want to grab power over the economy. So we do see that applied, for example, in China and Russia. Mostly what you might would call, and maybe what your audience might would understand to be, as like the enemies of Western democracy. They typically just take a very strong command and control aspect of everything. And it's only rational, right? Like, if like I said, if you want to influence the culture, you also want to control the economy. If you want to control the economy, you might could get away with letting people live free and die young and all that sort of stuff, but that doesn't seem too conducive either, right? So if you want strong workers to work in the coal mines, for example, then you don't want them to just be dying of opioids all the time, right? So you want to restrict their freedom to basically turn them into good subordinates, worker bees. Likewise, you see lots of places that basically take a laissez-faire approach to both culture and the economy. So that is the most. I can't say that that happens every time. There are countries that that right and left configuration is not like that, and the U.S. is importantly one of those countries. So weirdly enough, you see what almost appears to be a left in the United States that has a very kind of like anti-freedom, however they might would want to spin it, but basically not super pro-market with respect to the economy, but definitely the maximally laissez-faire perspective on culture, right? Freedom to do just about anything with your personal life that you want. Abortion is one example. Any type of different sexualities and identities would be another. Just plenty of things like that. And conversely, and this is the last little bit of the grand theory of the right and left, which is that the right is basically the mirror image of that, right? So people can debate and they can point to Trump as an example with some of his policies like tariffs and things like that and say that, oh, well, they're not super pro market, but they are, right? They are. That there is a conceptual anchor to some extent, I would say to a large extent, on the right, that markets are sort of the way to determine a lot of these things. And that is their view on the economy. There's, of course, disagreement. You have people like Orrin Cass, who are much more classically on the left with respect to economics. You have Vance is definitely interesting in that regard. But for the most part, when they are not obsessed with the culture war, they basically don't take super strong positions on the economy. And then likewise, culturally, the US stands alone. If you look at Western democracies, where we have a pronounced social conservatism, significantly more pronounced than many other Western countries. And that is odd. Like, if you really step back and think about it, it seems like kind of the left and right, it does not logically line up to many other countries. And that's basically the issue we deal with. So the end of the grand theory of the right and left is just saying that if you're a freedom loving type person, or if you have inclinations towards freedom or something like that, then you should be, basically absolutely dismayed and distraught by the current right and left, where you have, you don't have a consistently pro freedom party, right? So if you like freedom, you have a lot to worry about. Some people don't care about economic freedom. A lot of people don't care about cultural freedom. But if you happen to be one of the few people who just care about freedom in general, there's certainly a lot to be upset about. And the future looks bleak in that regard. But we have one easy way out, which is to elect Pete Buttigieg to president of the United States. So if we can do that, all of our problems are solved.
Yeah, I guess I don't have as bleak of a view as you. There it's a big question, like what is the economy doing and what is policy doing to the economy? So, when you listen to the economic left, they will say, well, we had these banking regulations from FDR, Glass-Steagall, or whatever, and those were removed, and that's why 2008 happened. So their argument would be that Reaganomics and Thatcherite economics came in, smashed a lot of those protections, and so America, and also historically, America had much higher tariffs in the 18th century. So we've gotten rid of a lot of our tariffs. We have free trade with NAFTA and also a lot of the EU, a lot of trade agreements with Asian countries like Japan and Korea and Australia and New Zealand. So we have, and again, that story isn't being told from the pro-market side, but it's kind of this anti-free market side that says, no, we need to bring protectionism back. We need to bring back unions. We need to bring back, banking regulations and so on. And so they see that they feel that they're losing that battle, and they've accused specifically this Occupy Wall Street movement of being, because it failed to achieve anything, but it created a lot of ruckus. Their idea is that wokeism was this cultural distraction to economic leftism, and like a cat playing with a toy, the left has basically become distracted from their economic mission, and things have just, gone crazy with wealth disparity, and billionaires have more wealth than ever before. Really, in American history, I think you could make that argument. I don't know if it's true, but we have the Gilded Age, and I haven't crunched the numbers on that one. But that would be their perspective. That would be their argument. If you want to flip that on its head, you could just take all those arguments and say, well, actually, this is all good, and therefore I'm optimistic about the future because we're having more economic freedom. On the cultural angle, I think there are people, for instance, Kevin Phillips, he left the Republican Party because he felt it was becoming too theocratic. And I think what Kevin Phillips, as I always go back to him as the first political scientist I ever encountered. And, there was a period where I thought he was just totally, completely wrong, because he was writing in 2006, and that was really just the beginning of like the new atheist movement on YouTube, like 2008. And so I was like, wow, Kevin Phillips really didn't see this thing coming. Obviously, had new atheism never happened and decline of religiousness never happened, he would have been right. Like, evangelicals just have more kids, and so they're inevitably going to take over the country. But because there was this huge movement toward, religious non-alignment, I said, I guess this theory turned out to be wrong, which, I'm grateful for. But with something like QAnon and, talking about conspiracy theories, it seems to me that even like the problems that Kevin Phillips had with evangelical Christianity are still exist, and they are in some sense growing. Now, are they growing in an absolute sense? Like, there was a satanic panic in the 1980s. Do more people believe in, child sacrificing elites in 2024 than they did in the 1980s? I'm not sure. I think that I don't have the data on that. I think we would tend to say it's more so now. I think partially because as almost, I guess my model, and this doesn't exactly make sense, but I'm just going to say it anyway. I think evangelical culture has secularized and permeated. It's basically in the same way that we could say like wokeism is a secular version of Christianity. Like, conspiracyism is a secular form of evangelicalism. So these are two parallel political religions that have come and are ostensibly secular, ostensibly agnostic. You don't need to believe in God in order to believe in conspiracy theories. It's kind of a neutral thing in the conspiracy crowd, whether or not you believe in God. They almost have a very deistic conception in that regard. Like, they believe that they have these very strong moral positions that, the elites aren't just impractical. They're not just incompetent. They're literally sacrificing children. And again, a lot of those people who I've encountered don't necessarily need to have any kind of belief in God or the Bible in order to say, well, this is obviously objectively wrong. And I agree. If lizard people were sacrificing children, that would be objectively wrong. I just believe that's not happening. But so those are basically, that's the cynicism, I guess, on the cultural sense is, as conspiracies become more powerful, there's this risk of a kind of a breakthrough or a January 6th event where you summon so much energy, so much intensity, really religious fervor, that it kind of breaks through the dam of liberal democracy, and you just get like, military show trials or whatever they're fantasizing about. I don't actually think that's very likely at this point. And so, I think the conspiracy stuff is a problem. I think we've had it before with the John Birch Society. I mean, I think that we've had waves of conspiratorial thinking. Going back in the day, we had the anti-Freemasonic Party, which was accusing the Founding Fathers of being Freemasons, which they were, but saying it was a bad thing. So we have these phases. We go through these phases, and I don't think it's insurmountable, but it's also difficult to legislate conspiracies away. It's difficult to say, like, we're going to censor you and thou shalt not believe in conspiracy theories. That's not always easy to do or effective or conducive to freedom. So, is there a direct way that you can handle that? It's kind of like the birth rates. Like, okay, birth rates are going down. What do we do about that? Well, a lot of countries have tried a lot of different programs, and nothing seems to work except direct religiousness. Like, actually, religious belief seems to be the only thing that changes the situation in a positive direction. So, yeah, I guess I would say for America, that's a very nebulous or high-minded, idealistic vision of we're going to create a new religion to overtake the conspiracy thinking. That's a very grand vision, whereas some of the more material, down-to-earth policy stuff like abortion, I think I don't underestimate like the small dedicated core of Catholic Supreme Court justices being willing to like legislate from the bench, and I'm sure the left would do the same thing with gay marriage or whatever. They did it with Roe v. Wade. So I'm not doubting their desire to do that, but ultimately, if the legislature is against it, and they can just overrule the Supreme Court with legislature. So I think that both the the Democrat and the Republican Party, with the end of Roe v. Wade, are trending toward just, we're going to have abortion in America. You know, states like whatever, Kansas, Nebraska are voting for abortion. There's like some funny data out of Florida where it's like, you know, in Florida, they love Trump, they love abortion, and they love weed. It's like, you know, the trifecta of issues that you don't get in that two-party coalition. You don't see those preferences expressed until you just do referendums on each issue. So yeah, I guess I'm basically optimistic about reproductive autonomy. I'm optimistic even about, I mean, Governor Newsom just vetoed a bill for AI regulation. So I'm optimistic about the freedom of technological development. Yeah, I don't know exactly what else you would say in a concrete way. I mean, again, we agree there is this nebulous religious force of conspiracy thinking that could like disrupt the normal, you know, safety guarantees of freedom and you know, do something crazy, and we don't even know what that would be. But outside of that, in terms of actual policy that's being put forth by the Republicans, yeah, I mean, they'll do some symbolic things, like they'll put up the 10 Commandments in a classroom or something. But, you know, religion is still declining overall. I don't actually know what the worst case scenario would look like exactly in terms of, you know, I can certainly say for the left, if AOC wins, she becomes the president, she's gonna do some economic leftism. But like, if, you know, who would it be if Rick Santorum? I mean, who is this like conservative person? Is it are you thinking more in terms of immigration restriction as a form of like cultural restriction, when you say, you know, the freedom is under threat on the cultural field?
Yeah, there's a lot to say there. To respond to that last point, the failure modes, like, so I agree with much of what you said. So if I have to rephrase, I would say that it's not, you know, there is a lot to worry about, in the sense that there's always plenty of things to worry about. There's always stuff where there's always a trend you can point at that looks really bad. At the end of the article, I basically say, like, okay, here are some solutions, and here are some things that, and I rate them based on likelihood of what I just think is, like, you know, the modal outcome, or the outcomes that are most least likely. And the first one I think is the most likely, which is that, you know, we just shamble along basically on the current trends we've been going on. And that's related to there's a lot of weird data that you can find, right? So you can find that in spite of the differences between the two parties, it's not even obvious what impact various policies have. Like, you can definitely point to things like AI regulation and say, like, okay, that would definitely, this very specific policy proposal has this specific impact. And that's just partly it's easier to measure. But like, if you look at things, like, a lot of people complain about the federal code of regulations just monotonically increasing over time, right? And we, in theory, have a party that would stop that, and yet it never happens, right? So it's almost like, and it's the same way, that's for the right. For the left, I would say unionization rates is a perfect example. We have had, you know, Biden is I'm told, the most pro-labor president since the founding of the country, or something crazy. You'll hear people say things like that, but and yet unionization rates basically haven't budged. I think they might have increased very so slightly in the last couple of years, but the last couple of years is a complete aberration, totally out of the norm in terms of worker power. And the fact that it has flatlined or increased maybe by 1% over the last couple of years is disastrous from a unionization perspective. So it's like, look, if the president's, you know, if Trump can't even decrease in an absolute terms the number of regulations there are, if Biden cannot meaningfully move the unionization rate, that is just super weird to me. So the extent to which influence, like, the president or the government even has, is kind of understudied given how important everyone says it is. So I would say there's a lot of weird stuff. So going back, what I think is the most likely outcome of all this is that we just shamble along at times above trend and at other times below trend, just kind of cyclically. And there are these waves that come and go, but the average is basically, I ultimately pass, my maybe a negative outcome to me would be like AOC or JD Vance becoming president. But even if they are, you can only be president in 4-year terms, and at max you can only be president for 8 years. It seems like we now exist in a world where even 8-year consecutive terms for presidents maybe are more or less likely than not. It just seems like we will just flip back and forth every 4 years continuously. And that is just not enough time to protect the policies that you instituted when you're president for the first 2 years. And you likely, at least statistically speaking, have control of both houses of Congress. Basically how it goes is the president's, why can't they just, it's a good question, right? So why can't Trump become president and the wing of the conspiratorial people who wish to do probably tons of harm to freedom and quality of life in the US, why can't they just do that is a good question. And there's the Constitution's in their way, time is in their way, right? So you get it for 2 years. If you have narrow majorities, then you face tons of drama. And if you lose a month here or there to Speaker of the House drama, you don't get that back, right? So if you fix it, if you appoint a new speaker amongst all the drama, that's just time lost and you don't get it back. You probably lose in a year and a half, never to recover both houses. And you just spend the rest of the time playing defense. So neither party, it seems, can achieve nearly as much as people say they can achieve. The stock market at least reacts to gridlock positively. So if there seems to be gridlock, if there seems like it's divided Congress, or if it seems like neither party has major control, it looks like, at least a cursory glance at the stock market, looks like it reacts positively to that news. So it anticipates things like economic growth and stocks going up and things like that going up, and basically line go up when there is gridlock. So it is weird that you can write what seems to be a lot of positive, or you can write what seems to be a lot of good points in favor of the idea that there's a lot of things to be negative about, and none of it come to pass. I think the world is a strange place. I think it's very weird. And yes, you can point to things like 2008 where policy, could have had an impact there. I think Kevin Erdman is a housing expert who wrote a book on 2008 and attributes a lot of it really not to the classic considerations of Glass-Steagall and financial deregulation. That I'm open-minded to the idea that the financial deregulation directly caused it. I'm not a libertarian or anything. I totally think the regulation can be fine sometimes, so I'm not going to die on that hill. But the point is that I think the world's a weird place. I think you can point to Roe v. Wade getting overturned. You can point to 2008. You can point to these sort of retrenchments of freedom and things like that. And in the end, to the shock of a lot of people, I guess Kansas will just vote in favor of abortion. Florida will just vote in favor of abortion. So the parties, the interesting thing about the US, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, is that the parties both have an authoritarian streak and an anti-freedom streak, and the parties both have a pro-freedom streak as well. But interestingly, the American populace, they're not just weak-minded sheep exactly, right? So you can look at other Western democracies and maybe see a populace is more placated. I know people like to clown on the British a lot for just seemingly just taking it lying down. I saw Noah Smith posted an article of this guy, this British guy who said, we shouldn't increase housing production because the houses would be unsafe. And it's like, if you're at the point where you're writing things like that, you really need to reconsider, where everything went wrong. And there's just a lot of problems with saying things like that. So I think the American populace, even, southern states, even southern red states voting in favor of abortion. Yeah, I think the world is a crazy place. And ultimately, I am positive, right? So in the long term, I see nothing really to be super negative about. But in the short term, at least, and I go into this in my other article about Kamala and Trump. In the short term, I think there is, if you're a freedom loving person, you've seen better days on the freedom side. But I think this year and I think the next few years are going to be great. I think line's going to go up in many respects. So I'm not a doomer, but it's just it's a very big way of saying that, trying to grab attention and also pointing to some negative things that I do think are real. But yeah, that's basically it with that.
You bring up an interesting graph in an article on economics. Why have your own political opinions when you can just copy economists? And this is a question I've been struggling with is, do I have any trust or faith in economics as a field? Libertarians will say, you got to listen to Hayek, Rothbard, Mises, the Austrian school's got it figured out. And they have completely different theories from, I don't know, Keynes or modern monetary theory or something like definitely different than a Marxist. If we just kind of cut the Marxists out, I still, I hear these things from the Austrians that they say, well, we can predict recessions. Like, we figured this out. We figured out the business cycle. People just don't want to listen to us because they're being paid off or something. They're being lobbied by big government. But I don't know. It just seems like in any other field, if that was true, in any field of science, you'd say like, okay, well, those group of scientists, we don't like them, and maybe they're underfunded or something. But like, if they're really making predictions that are true, then we kind of have to give them credit and adjust the model. In the same way that if we had bad polls in 2016, we have to adjust the polls and fix them. You post this little graph here. It says the proportion of reported p-values, and it shows at the top you've got informatics, mathematics, and physics, which I would hope, those would be at the higher end. And then at the bottom of the barrel seems to be economics, right next to ecology, evolution, and earth sciences, which, evolution kind of unpredictable, slow, random mutation. Earth sciences, I'm a bit confused because I think geology isn't that, okay, that's a pun, but isn't it a hard science? Shouldn't it be more predictable? But, maybe ecology, if you mix all those together, you mix in ecology, then you get a lot of fuzziness. And I was surprised to actually see psychology and sociology was above. So technically it wasn't. I would have expected psychology and sociology to be below economics, because it seems to me that, like, human sociological behavior is so much more influenced by our subjective interpretation of who's mentally ill, who's not mentally ill. There's cultural and religious values that come into play. You had a vision from God. Are you a schizophrenic or a prophet? So I expected that to be at the bottom, but it's actually economics. Can you explain? Like, I don't have a background in statistics. I keep hearing about p hacking. I hear about p values. Can you explain it to me like I'm 5? What is that?
Yeah. So basically, my sort of hold on one second. Go back up here. Okay, sorry. So my understanding of, and I don't have a super strong background in statistics. So that graph was pulled from Cremu, actually, and I think you had a response to Cremu at some point. But that was pulled from a post of his talking about p-hacking in general. So whenever I wrote the post, I think I read that, and that graph stuck out to me. And so I included it in here because it kind of demonstrated my point. But I also have questions about that data as well. So, like, how I look at it is, they have the lowest percentage, but that's the percent. I believe it's the percentage of the percentage of p-values between 0.01 and 0.05. So how that works is that actually, if the lower percentage you have is actually better. So economics ranking at the top indicates that there's not that it appears to be, and I don't want to proclaim that like one field is just better than another, but it appears to be that they're less p-hacked. And p-hacking, basically what that is about is essentially if you conduct a study, p-hacking can be done in a lot of ways, but you can say I want to study the effects of say I have a bunch of different foods and I want to study, which foods have the biggest effects on sleep. What you can do is you can study 100 of them, and after you get all the results from that, you can find 5 that are significant and then publish only those 5. But what you've actually done is you would expect, just from randomness, 5% to be false positives. So if you started off with 100 and you've narrowed it all the way down to 5, you're going to get that every time. So having 5 significant results is not super revolutionary if you studied 100. That could just as easily be total chance. So what you want to do is you want to say, okay, we're not just going to study a bunch of foods, we're going to study coffee. And then if you study just coffee because you have reason to believe or you have a hypothesis that coffee affects sleep in whatever way you're studying it, then if that comes up significant, that is less likely to be a false positive because you weren't just scattershot, like, you didn't have the shotgun approach. An interesting thing about it, and you pointed out, is like physics being where it is and a few of them being where they are kind of interesting. I've looked into this myself. So why does like these fields, why does economics and things like sociology and stuff like that end up more towards the top? Yeah, different people have different opinions about it. So I saw Noah Smith, for example, pointed out that economics is a very self-critical field. I will say anecdotally that appears true. So when I see people on Twitter arguing about things, a lot of times it's economists getting into nasty fights over what seem to be sort of small differences in opinion, or somebody got one thing wrong and they're just sort of tearing into each other. As to why that is, it's a chicken and the egg question. So why is the field super critical that might produce this anxiety or this fear about publishing something that might be found out to be untrue later? So it causes them to try to publish genuinely true results in the first place. I'm not totally sure what came first. Was the field critical first, or were the people, was the field that way first, or how did it change over time, or who came first, right? And I'm not totally sure. Noah Smith puts his hands in the air and just says, oh, it's culture. That could possibly be it. I'd be interested in seeing the different fields segregated by sex to see perhaps maybe if you have a lot of guys involved, maybe they're more critical. Another thing would be, and I think that to some extent this is true, which is that you can see political affiliation in the field of economics is a lot less extreme than in other fields. So for different fields, you'll see it being 20 to 1 or 30 to 1, 40 to 1 Democrat to Republican. In economics, I saw one poll, I think in the 90s, that said it was maybe 2 to 1 Democrat Republican. I think nowadays it might be as high as 4 to 1, 5 to 1, maybe even more. But regardless of what it is, it looks like, if you're published. So why isn't the field? Here's a good question, right? If the field leans, even though it's less heavily Democratic than other fields, if it leans that much Democratic, why aren't the results all just Marxism, basically? Well, if Marxism is false, in reality, if it is false, then if you publish a paper that purports that various theories about the economy are true that maybe are not true, then you still have 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people who are maybe politically independent or Republican who are heavily motivated to point out all the flaws in your research. So all you need is sort of a dash of independent thinking or contrarian thinking, and you get a big overcorrection in how accurate the field actually is. And so, yeah, people ask this, why isn't the field, if it's so heavily leaning Democratic, why do you see all this difference between economists' opinions on things like rent control, right? So Biden, Harris comes out in favor of nationwide rent control or something like that. Why do economists publicly voice, and they did publicly voice their disagreement with that, even though the vast majority of them supposedly support the Democratic Party. It's a good question. I mean, I think you could tell a cynical story. People like to tell cynical stories about how experts are always heavily motivated by, sort of bad incentives. In this case, I mean, yeah, you can tell that story, but at the end of the day, there are people who do care about truth, or at the least, there are enough people who care about truth that will come out and say, hey, rent control is bad, or hey, this is bad, when the president or some politician says their policy. And so, yeah, I mean, it is strange to me. You would think physics would be lower. I wonder if they will have a higher proportion in that range, just because it's so hard to discover new things that have a p-value of like 0.0001%, right? If they discover some new type of some physical structure or something, maybe it's just so hard to determine that just by its very nature, a lot of the published things you see are just not going to be at that level. That could perhaps explain it. But yeah, I mean, the p values have been discussed, and why economics sticks out in kind of a somewhat positive light in that regard. Like I said, Noah Smith has talked about it, and the consensus seems to be that economics is a critical field. And yeah, it's very vicious out there. And if you look at Twitter, it seems to be true, I guess. It looks like, other fields might be more homogenous, and then economists always argue with each other. That's at least what I see.
That's the exact opposite of what I thought, the graph said. So that's embarrassing. But,
Yeah.
I'm learning something, which is good. That's why I do this, because I actually don't know everything. And so I need people to correct me. You know, I guess I'm kind of, I'm trying to adjust to this new information, and I
Yeah.
find it easy to I find it easier to say, economic data, it's a lot. It's like, okay, well, we did this price control, or we did this rent control, or we ran a model. We ran a model where we jack up, or we control the price, and then we see what happens in this model, and we run it a million times, and it always comes up with the same result. Um, you know, that I guess I can understand why you're getting very regular results. You're not getting like vastly different results out of doing those sorts of experiments. I guess I am having to reevaluate what the word physics means, in terms of like, what even are these experiments? And I assume that they're not doing experiments like, well, if we shot a cannonball out of a cannon, where would it land? Like, they're probably not
Yes.
doing experiments like that. That's basically, it seems that in economics, we are constantly relitigating things that maybe we've been litigating for 300 years, and we're still not able to just say, like, it is a scientific fact that rent controls are bad. We don't see, it doesn't seem like, the gods of economics are able to force that down our throats in a dogmatic way. Whereas it does seem with physics that physicists have been able to section off and basically say 99% of physics is known physics. We know exactly what it does. We know exactly how it does what it does. And it's very predictable. And so there's no need for further research. We're not going to relitigate this. The only research we're going to do is highly experimental, highly theoretical. We're in CERN. We're under Switzerland. We're deep underground. We're shooting particles. We don't even know what these particles are. They're God particles. We don't even know if they exist, or how fast they're going, or where they are. And so I guess the way that I try to defend physics here and saying the reason why all their studies look so wonky is because they're trying really hard not to be redundant and do things over again. Whereas economists, I guess my assumption now, and I could be wrong about this, but my assumption is just that they're kind of saying, well, I guess the Biden administration wants to do rent controls. I guess we'll do a study on that and see what comes out. And it's like, okay, yeah, we've done this before, so we're almost going through the motions. Like, what would be the equivalent of the God particle in economics? What would be the equivalent of like theoretical economics? Like, you have to do some like Nick Land style craziness to get into theoretical economics, I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah. And what I would say is that the position of physics on that graph, I imagine, would be in a better state if you had people questioning basic physics all the time, right? So if they're questioning it all the time, and that gives you, as a researcher, I imagine, a lot of ammunition to just relitigate the same question over and over again. And yeah, if 50% of the country thought that, you know, if you the rate of something falling due to gravity is different than what it actually is, then you would get p-value. If you ran a study trying to disprove that, you would get a p-value of 0.000000, probably a bunch of zeros, one, saying that nope, it's like 9.82 meters per second squared or something like that. And if every 3 years people kept saying that it wasn't 9.82 meters per second squared, as faculty and as a research department, you would rack up the number of papers that appear to definitively prove that, you know, people are wrong about that. The interesting thing now, I will say this: physics is low on that graph, but it's a good position to be in, I think, because, you know, the real questions being asked. You know, they put the Webb telescope up there, and they're looking at a lot of crazy stuff. So if that's the price to pay for having some wonky position on a graph one time, I think it's totally worth it. As to, you know, what is the God particle in economics? I don't know. Supply and demand, I guess. It's a rough model and everything's imperfect. So obviously it's not a perfect curve, but I think people basically take the idea that, like, you know, if you have a supply of something and you have a demand and you have an equilibrium, and then you shift the supply. If we all want soda, and you know, if we reach some equilibrium and a meteorite comes out of the air and strikes the biggest soda factory in the world, then it seems natural that we'd be paying higher for soda, or suppliers would be paying higher for soda, or, you know, something would happen due to that supply change. So why, it's a good question, is why does economics get that position near the top of the graph? And not every field was included, and what you define as a field can also water things down. So if you restricted the physics part to just basic physics, I imagine it would be at number one. So what is all included in that? Probably it's a broad label, including, like what you said, theoretical physics and really hard problems where I am forgiving of researchers for getting it wrong because of just how difficult it is at this point, just because physics has been studied for hundreds and hundreds of years, and people have been looking at the stars since you know, antiquity. Um, so for economics, the interesting thing is that, yeah, for some reason, people are very skeptical of supply and demand. I had a friend, this restaurant, known for, I'm not going to say its name, but known for having really high prices in a field where, you know, in a market where people usually don't have high prices. They announced that they were going to lower prices. And my friend said, well, that's not going to increase demand. You know, nobody's going to eat there now that the prices went down. And that's very interesting. If you really think about that, that's an interesting thing to say, because the same person was like, oh, they're so expensive, so I'm not going to eat there. And it's like, oh, well, if they lower the prices, nobody is going to change their mind and eat there. And I think that's interesting. Now, I'm not going to die on the hill that demand increased when they lowered prices. I'm not, look, I'm not putting my line on the line for this stuff. I'll let the economists do that. But what I will say is that, yeah, you see like very skeptical ideas of things all the time. Economics is highly politically charged. And when you poll people for years now, it wasn't always like this. In the 60s, if you polled people on what the most pressing issue was, they might have said something like racism. They might have said something like civil rights. But I believe since about 2000 or since the 90s, continuously the economy has ranked number one when you poll people on what's the most important issue. And yeah, so people care about the economy. Presidents take a position on the economy. They don't tend to take positions on physics. If they took strong positions on physics, I bet the physics field would be kind of happy about that. It'd be more work for them to churn through. So economists basically have this position where if we take, and it's not just Noah Smith saying this, but there are other people who've said the same idea about economics as a very hostile field, very self-critical, very hostile. And I'm not saying I fully buy that, but I can see it, you know, with my own eyes. To some extent, it's hostile. If, you know, if presidents take these big positions every 2 to 4 years on the economy, and if we live in this highly conspiratorial world where people live in totally different worlds and have totally, some people have one set of facts and other people have another set of facts, I can totally see how there's almost endless fodder for economists to disprove things. Rent control is a great example. My anticipation is basically every Democratic president is going to at some point say something wrong about rent control, and it will be talked about, and economists will disavow that continuously. Republican presidents will say things about immigration, how immigration only lowers wages for workers or something like that, which is obviously not true, because you have that's basically what I believe they call the lump of labor fallacy, not including that immigrants consume things, so they increase demand as well. So they're not just warm bodies that increase the supply of labor and don't increase demand. So yeah, I don't know what it is. I speculate as to why people have weird views about things. But yeah, for whatever reason, people care about the economy and they just keep on getting it wrong. And economists have a bunch of low-hanging fruit to correct in a way that physicists don't. And I think that's basically what's happening.
It's very interesting because we live in a democracy, and the idea is that, like, optimally, we're going to vote, the majority is going to vote, and when the majority votes, when 51% of the populace votes for somebody or something, that somebody or something is supposed to represent, like, the average good of the entire country. But that's not necessarily the case. So with something like immigration, or take unionization, or even rent controls, I mean, if I was living in an apartment and the rent was going up, and then somebody said, I'm going to control your rent, I'd be like, cool, you should do that. I don't want my rent to go up. But it's not, I mean, look, and I want to be as charitable to economic leftism as possible, but it's pretty hard not to admit that there's going to be some kind of, there's going to be some kind of depressive effect on the overall housing market. On, people don't want to build new housing because they're not operating at a profit. The landlords don't want to take care of it because they're not earning a profit. People are just going to, so there's all these externalities. But yeah, if you're renting, and you're not thinking about that, and you're like, well, I have a high time preference. In the short term, I'd like my rent to be lower. This policy would achieve that, therefore I support it. And that kind of like naked selfishness is behind a lot of these policies. Now, when it comes to this question of are people allowed to be nakedly selfish? Are we capable of not being nakedly selfish? What should our opinion be toward that? As something like immigration, I think that I agree that it affects different sectors of the economy in different ways and different players in different ways. So, if I'm a factory owner and immigrants come in and they work in my factory, I'm getting this direct benefit. And so maybe I can expand my operations, and therefore, because I'm economizing at scale, I can lower the price of goods, and that has good downstream effects on people, and so on and so forth. And then other companies can afford to hire more employees and expand because their inputs are cheaper, because my output is cheaper, so on and so forth. While that is true, it is also true that a lot, and specifically, and we confuse this so much between, there's legal immigration, there's illegal immigration, but there's different kinds of legal immigration. So there's green card-based immigration, there's marriage-based immigration, there's chain migration, there's basically academic immigration. There's, we give out, we allow people to immigrate if they pay like $1 million, you can come into this country. If you're a genius or something, there's programs for that. But there's also programs for refugees. And when I last crunched the numbers over the last 15 years or so, these are programs that have cost, I think, billions of dollars. And it's actually a relatively small number of people out of the total pie of all immigrants, certainly not a majority. And I think I came up, and someone's got to correct my figures and fact check me on this, but I came up with a figure of like $800,000 per refugee. Now, obviously, that's not, they don't just give them a lump sum. What they do is they buy housing, and they provide educational services, and they provide welfare, and they provide, food, they provide health care. I mean, every social program is just sort of defaulted with, and maybe there's an idea that, okay, that is the cost, but as you've said, those people also have jobs, and they work, and they contribute to the economy, and they end up paying taxes, and their kids end up getting jobs and paying taxes. So, when I say 800,000, I'm not counting the fact that these people are maybe contributing, they're maybe earning a wage of, $40,000 to $80,000 a year, and they're contributing to the economic productivity of whatever sector they're working in, and so on. So it's not a net loss of 800,000, but it's an initial investment of about 800,000. And that's going to be different for different refugee groups. So obviously, Ukrainians who have a much higher percentage they have how do I say this? Education in Ukraine is probably better than in Haiti. So if you're bringing someone over from Ukraine, they're probably going to require less welfare, and they're probably going to immediately insert themselves into the economy in a more productive way than someone who's a refugee from Haiti. So we can't even generalize all refugees and say, oh, well, all refugees are a drain on the system, because that's not true either, at least not to the same extent. So we've got all these different forms of immigration, which have various levels of costs and benefits, some of which are distributed, some of which are concentrated, and we just all put it under one word. We call it immigration. And we either say immigration is good or immigration is bad. And those are the only two positions you're allowed to have. And you're never allowed to say, well, hey, there's cultural factors. There's a cultural factor of maybe you think that Springfield, Ohio should be happy to welcome in 20,000 people from another culture. But the fact is, if they don't, you are going to drive people toward these conspiratorial forces that we've spoken about. This is a problem in Europe as well, where they have a security threat from Russia. But because of the immigration issue, you get far-right parties winning that otherwise wouldn't be winning, that have very basically, they have conspiratorial views about the EU. They think, the EU is evil, and it's trying to destroy European people because of basically cultural factors. So I think those also have to be taken into account. And, as we're coming to the end of the hour here, before I let you go and give your final thoughts and final words, I wanted to basically put a footnote in the conversation on this issue of economics, which I've been thinking for a while. Like, we really need a grand theory of economics, but what is the problem that needs to be solved? And I guess I don't have that off the top of my head, but the way that I'm picturing the structure of economics, whereas I often think of physics as a pyramid, where you have basic physics, and then it gets more complex, and then eventually you work up to theoretical quantum physics. I don't think that I would model economics like a pyramid with a base, and then it gets more complex and crazy at the top. I would actually model economics like a diamond, where there's a very thick middle region. We talk about macroeconomics and microeconomics, but there's a thick middle region, which is like rent controls. And then if you go above that to the macro level, you're going to be talking about like you almost start getting into calories. I think you start getting into like I forget what the term, I don't know if it's Isaac Asimov who came up with this, but there's this science fiction term that refers to the total amount of energy that a civilization is able to harness. And you start thinking in those terms at a certain level of macroeconomics. But then on the other hand, you have the microeconomics of like, okay, I own a business, and technically I'm engaged in the practice, or I'm engaged in an economic experiment, right? So, in a sense, we have all these economists doing research and doing experiments. But if we counted every single business owner who started a business as a researcher in economics, we would find that there's actually a lot of, bankruptcy and business failure and so on. And so, that middle region, that centers on rent controls, which is like this policy heavy region, that's kind of the it's a 4-year election cycle. Those sort of issues, that's pretty settled. That's pretty stable. We know what's going on there. But if you get to like super macroeconomic things like, how do we best harness the energy of the planet? You're getting into engineering questions. You're getting into sociological or religious questions. Whereas if you go to the extreme micro level, you're basically saying, how do I run this business? And, there's some books out there you can read, but again, if we were just to say every small business owner is an economics researcher, then there's a lot of disagreement in the field, and there's a lot of confusion in the field because most businesses don't succeed. But I guess that was just a fun thought that I had. I wanted to make sure I get that out there before I let you respond and kind of tidy everything up for, I've brought us in all sorts of directions, but I believe you will steer us true. So give us your final thoughts and let us know kind of, what's on your mind for new articles and people. You've already shouted out, Noah Smith and some of the people you think we should be reading, but anyone else you haven't mentioned doesn't have to be relevant to this conversation, but you have the floor, sir.
Awesome. Yeah, a lot of that's very interesting. So obviously, if you expand the definition of, let's just expand the definition of economists to include people who are not economists and to include just business people, then you'll get p-values across an enormous range because we all participate in the economy. We all have different opinions and views of that. The interesting thing about capitalism and about all this nifty stuff we've been talking about is you actually don't have to have all the answers. So economics is just not like physics. And if you poll, we don't even have to expand the definition of economists to include a bunch of people who aren't economists. We can just look at economists themselves, and we can go to chicagoigm.com. I think it's the Clark Center, and they run polls of economists, and you'll see that the answers that they give on various policy questions are not totally one-sided. In many cases, they look like a bell curve. And that's because the study of economics and sociology and all these things, it's the human sciences, and people change over time. So if you can't conduct real science on in an ethical world, at least, you cannot take someone and put them in poverty intentionally and then feed them back income in a sort of scaling UBI to determine what happens to their body weight here, what happens to their happiness here, what happens to you can't just puppet people like that. I certainly don't believe in conducting those types of experiments, and very few people do. So what you have to look is at natural experiments, and if all you have are natural experiments, you're limited by what has happened. So there's so much that's just going to be unknowable. I hope, and I'm optimistic about things like physics and about technology and biotechnology and things like that, that we can conduct enough experiments on mice to determine how to increase lifespans. I think that's basically ethical, and I'm glad about that. But that's the first thing, is that we don't even have to look at business people. We can just look at economists and see that some economists support rent control. So it's not unanimous. I'm a big believer in consensus, and I argue in the article as such that people should just look to consensus as a starting point. From there, if you're a business person and all these economists are saying one thing, I think you're totally free to disagree with them and say, look, I get why they would have that wrong, but in reality, people basically react to price increases negatively inherently. And I live in and I work in the fashion industry, and in my industry, it looks like people respond to price increases positively because behavioral economics, they look at a more expensive shirt and they think it's inherently better. And if you survey on them, they'll tell you it's better, even though scientifically speaking, we look and see this shirt is made of this much cotton, this much polyester, and it's the identical to this shirt. And all that determines a $500 difference is a logo. So we are not homo economists. We're not a particle. And we change. What would have worked in the past, like mercantilism and having tariffs, that could have legitimately been correct then. I would go so far as to say it might have literally been correct then. But people change and times change. And today we have such a connected world that comparative advantage is more important than ever. So if comparative advantage is more important, and if my country produces bananas the best and your country produces this because we have differences in seasons, and so we literally can't produce that, then importing it is a great idea. Importing it actually increases your wealth. And people coming out and saying that, oh, if we import those bananas, if we import that fruit, it decreases our wealth. Well, they're just wrong, right? They're not looking at the whole picture. They are looking at accounting and saying that wealth has gone down, even though in one world you have access to new fruit and in the other world you don't. So the laws of economics, I'm sure, can change. I'm not an economist, but I'd like to talk to one about that and ask, if you could go in the past, if you had total control, would you shift the US from being mercantilist to being, more capitalist or something like that? I would be surprised if they would say, yeah, it would be totally normal to pull the brakes on that, even though everyone else is launching trade wars against us, that we would somehow end up better by just surrendering to trade wars, essentially. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, if people are self-interested, why isn't the U.S. Communist already? Why aren't we full communist? Why aren't we full socialist? Because if you poll voters time and time again, they come back and say that increases in spending across the board are positive. There's almost no line item in the federal budget that you can find a majority of people saying shouldn't be increased or at least stay the same. So there's no meaningful constituency amongst voters for decreasing the role of the government in the economy. Everyone basically wants their own version of protectionism, perhaps for the same basic logic that influenced every country hundreds of years ago to be mercantilist. It's just that people are self-motivated, they're self-interested, and it's not that they're lying when they say that they think protectionism is good. They're telling the truth that when they want protectionism for their industry, that's good. So that's the first thing. So, why aren't we full communists? Why aren't we full socialists if supposedly everyone favors massive, unprecedented increases in spending time and time again? Well, it's that people are, there's a lot to that. If you're someone like Richard Hanania, you'd probably say that, well, diversity causes it. So, still you have to get over that line of 51% for a lot of things, not everything, but for a lot. And if we have diversity and if we have culture wars and things like that, then that basically acts as a type of distraction for, that creates room for corporations and elites to basically do as they please. Which is something that's probably going to make the U.S. maybe more capitalist in some sense. But that's one angle. The other angle, and I would say is the most important angle, is that people are self-interested, but they also vote based on their reality. It is, I believe personally, true that if we shifted to adopting all these ideas that voters have about just unprecedented increases in spending across every dimension and full protectionism and 1,000,000% tariffs and all this stuff, that life would get meaningfully worse. And once life would get meaningfully worse, voters would vote out the person in power and vote in someone advocating for change. So yes, it seems odd that given polling questions, we're not just super command and control, or at least some light version of that. So why does the U.S. stand apart from other countries in that way? It's a complicated question, and part of it is that if we would have voted for Bernie Sanders and if he would have been able to institute a lot of what he wanted, if life got worse under his rule, they would have voted him out and put in someone else, despite how much they might say that they agree with his policies time and time again. The reality is that when push comes to shove, the U.S. is just not ready to go in that direction. I don't have all the answers as to why the U.S. is the way it is and why, business owners would say one thing about the economy and economists would say something else and voters would say something else. Why does the locus of the conversation seem to center around elite opinion as opposed to just everyday average working people opinion? I can't tell you. I have my theories. Hanania has his. Other people have written endlessly about this. But yeah, probably at the end of the day, we're just not ready to do that, because if life got worse, then people would change. And that's a long-winded way of saying that, just like with p-values and just like with studies, if you'll have some results that go off to the left tail. You'll have some results that go off to the right, but you'll have one result that continues to show up, and that's just because it's true, right? I mean, it's true. That's why if you randomly do studies and you look at a survey, the value keeps coming up positive, and that is probably the correct one. And in the same way, it's like if you're a Fukuyama believer, if you're an enjoyer of that kind of thought, and you think that Western democracy and these liberal values are the most optimal way to do things, once you get locked into that path, you probably have some path dependency, and it's really hard to move off. I mean, conservatives say all the time that any day now will turn into Venezuela, will turn into Haiti. And, I just don't know how likely that is. It seems like you get to a higher sort of plane of the economy and politics, and you just stick there and you just ride it out. And so, what does that mean if we're at the end of history and we're just going to stick with what the economists say? We're not going to have massive rent control. We're not going to have massive changes. I don't know what happens. People probably start to get angry. They start to get agitated. And if we can't make any moves, if we're always beholden to what economists say, that's going to be a really tough problem, considering that problems and issues will occur in the world, and we'll have to at least pretend to have some response to them.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about the history of American politics and economics. But I think that was a good conclusion to this discussion. Was there anyone else other than Richard and Noah? Again, things that you're working on, or articles that you might be forecasting for the future outside of the topics we've covered today.
Yeah. So as far as other writers, I unfortunately live in kind of an echo chamber with respect to the writers I read who are bloggers. I try to read a diverse range of just authors in general. I'm looking at my bookshelf now. But yeah, I mean, Noah Smith, Richard Hanania, Matt Iglesias, Scott Alexander, all those types of people I think are great. Your posts I do enjoy a lot as well. So I recommend, if for some reason your audience hasn't read those people, I would definitely recommend them to do so, just to read different things. And then the last thing I would say is read other things aside from politics all the time. So, making your life only about politics, only about these things is kind of dull, and you can go too far. So there's plenty of other people to read. Just in that narrow slice. As far as what I'm working on, the next sort of big article that I'm going to write, and it perhaps will be my biggest one, is on this book called The Rise and Fall of the Republican Party. So yeah, it's just going to be a big deep dive, a big old book review, probably the longest one yet, just talking about the Republican Party since essentially since World War II up to today. And yeah, it's an interesting topic. The Republican Party's it's just very interesting, and so that's what I'll be writing about next.
Excellent. Well, Josh, we will look forward to reading that, hopefully sometime soon. Until then, I really appreciate you coming on and correcting some misapprehensions, helping me understand some p-values, and becoming a little bit better. So really appreciate it, and hope we can speak again soon.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, and yeah, we can definitely talk again soon. Okay.
Beautiful. All right. Take care, Josh.
Yeah. Bye-bye. You too.
Bye-bye. All right. We did it. You got to like, you got to comment, you got to restack. And if you like what I'm doing, if you like watching me learn about p-values in real time, this is a man who's never Googled what is a p-value. I had to Google it while we were talking, and it's a probability value. And I don't, my lack of education is glaring here. But if you enjoy watching me learn on the fly, if you enjoy watching me make mistakes and get corrected, then why not financially support this program? We're doing lots of articles, lots of interviews, doing a full year of articles and interviews, hundreds and hundreds of hours of content, really, for your perusal. So if you want to support, this is my full-time, this is my dream. This is my dream, to be a full-time, what do they call it, content creator. So if you like it, and if you want to make it sustainable for years to come, consider making a. I guess I don't know if I can legally say it's a charitable donation because it goes through Substack. So I mean, Substack is a for-profit corporation. Um, but consider whether it's legally charitable or not. Consider being charitable in your heart if you enjoyed this one. I enjoy learning about new things and thinking about, like, to me, that was valuable to think, okay, economics is not a pyramid, it's a diamond. That was just something that came to me. So, yeah, that was valuable. It was a good one. Appreciate it. Till next time, guys, thanks for watching or thanks for listening. Take care, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.